Late 1970s, Quebec was a place where nightlife neon hid the flash of gunfire, and a friendly knock at the door could be the last sound you heard. In the chaos between the Hells Angels and the Outlaws, one ghost moved faster than rumor and left fewer witnesses than questions. He killed with guns, blades, rope, and sometimes fire and air pressure. They called him Apache. He called it work. The city called it fear. The secret of who he really served would take years to surface. The world that built Apache. In most places, the 1970s were remembered for disco and denim. In Quebec, they were remembered for detonations. Montreal had become a red zone. Journalists called it that without irony, where 100 small gangs and a handful of large ones carved their initials into the city with knives and dynamite. The Hells Angels were coming north. The Outlaws were already there, backing local crews and staring across boulevards that felt like borders. And between them, young men learned that reputation traveled faster than the police. Quebec hadn't always breathed like this. Through the Great Darkness, 1936 to 1960, the province had been tightly wound, ultra-conservative, clerical, orderly on paper. Then the 1960s snapped the cord. Reforms arrived like a storm front. Norms flipped. Youth culture flooded into the streets. There were more bands, more drugs, more night, more of everything. By the decade's end, outlaw motorcycle clubs, OMCs to cops, clubs to insiders, weren't fringe anymore. They were a fashion, a rebellion, a job. By 1968, there were reportedly hundreds of biker outfits competing inside one province. That many patches grinding in the same space meant friction. Friction meant sparks. Sparks meant fires. If you wanted a future in this world, you learned two lessons fast. 1. Fear was a language everyone understood, and 2. The man who could speak it fluently got paid. Into that oxygen-thin air rode a 22-year-old from Montreal, who would soon be known by a name people spoke softly, Yves Trudeau. The club he joined, the Popeyes, wasn't famous for mercy. They collected debts, ran rackets, and when the price was right, solved problems for the West End gang and the mafia. Trudeau didn't arrive as a legend. He arrived as a quiet man who listened, watched, and learned the schedule of other men's lives. Violence in the Popeyes wasn't a test, it was a task list. The club's reputation for depravity wasn't decorated with rumor. It was documented by arrest sheets and coroner's pens. Where other prospects showed enthusiasm, Trudeau showed precision. He wasn't loud, he wasn't sloppy. He didn't preen for cameras. He sat at the end of bars and memorized faces, cars, exits. When it came time to act, he moved like someone who had rehearsed it twice behind his eyes. Across the river, the Outlaws were investing in Canada through a partner, Satan's Choice. The Popeyes clashed with them first in a proxy war that left 24 bodies cooling behind headlines. That conflict ended in a tired stalemate, but the map it left behind favored escalation. In 1977, Satan's Choice aligned more formally with the Outlaws. 5 months later, the Popeyes did something that would rattle every crew in the province. They patched over to become the first Hells Angels chapter in Canada. New patch, same streets, new hierarchy, same enemies. For Montreal, it felt like a weather change you couldn't see but could feel in your bones. For Yves Trudeau, it felt like a promotion into a company that valued results over excuses. The Angels built systems, the kind where a reliable specialist could climb quickly. Trudeau had already shown he knew how to make problems disappear. Now the problems had names, patches, and a calendar of funerals. Soon the city would learn his nickname. Soon it would learn to flinch at a knock. Becoming Apache, how a hitman learns to vanish. When Yves Trudeau first put on the Hells Angels patch, he wasn't yet Apache. That name would come later, after a kill so grotesque it scarred even the underworld. But by the late 1970s, he had already proven himself to be something rare. A biker who wasn't just violent, but methodical. Violence in biker culture wasn't unusual. Every chapter had its bruisers, men who could swing chains, empty pistols, or ignite Molotovs without hesitation. What made Trudeau stand out was his complete absence of hesitation. There was no pause before a trigger squeeze, no shake in his voice after a stabbing, no second thoughts about whether a target's wife or child was standing in the room. He didn't just do the job, he seemed to enjoy the silence afterward. The first major test came on February 17, 1978. Two outlaws, full colors, full swagger, walked into a bar in Montreal's East End, one the Angels claimed as their turf. The confrontation started with shouts, turned into fists, and ended with the Outlaws thrown out into the cold night air. They shouted threats through the door. Minutes later, headlights cut across the street. A car pulled up. The window rolled down. Behind it, Yves Trudeau leveled a pistol. Two quick bursts. One outlaw lay dead on the sidewalk. The other clutched a wound, screaming as Trudeau's taillights vanished. That was the spark. Quebec's first true biker war, the Hells Angels against the outlaws, had begun. Bombs followed, drive-bys rattled neighborhoods. Families fled houses too close to known biker hangouts. For every kill the outlaws tried to notch, the Angels answered with 2, 3, 4. And at the center of their counteroffensive was Trudeau. He didn't stick to one method. Sometimes he shot men through the eye as they answered the door. Sometimes he strangled them in alleys, leaving bodies crumpled like discarded coats. Sometimes he planted bombs, under cars, inside homes, even in televisions wired to explode when a cassette was pressed play. If someone was in the wrong place, whether it was a spouse, a child, or a bystander, they became part of the body count. To Trudeau, witnesses were just future problems. It was after one especially gruesome murder, a killing where he reportedly scalped a rival, that whispers began calling him Apache. The name wasn't given with admiration, nor with mockery. It was spoken the way a child whispers about a shadow at the end of a hallway. Fearful, uncertain, but aware it was real. Trudeau leaned into the identity. He joked about his kills in bars, laughed when the wrong man died, and shrugged when police tried to piece together timelines. To outsiders, he appeared jittery, always checking over his shoulder, quick to paranoia. But to his brothers, that paranoia was part of his survival instinct. It was also part of why his hits almost always succeeded. In the growing war, the Angels didn't just need fighters. They needed specialists who could terrify enemies into retreat before the fight even began. In Trudeau, they had a man who could turn strategy into scars. And while the outlaws bled, Apache sharpened his craft, one explosion at a time. The first biker war turns deadly. The firefight outside that Montreal bar in 1978 wasn't just a flashpoint, it was a declaration. From that night onward, Quebec's streets belonged to war. Car bombs rattled neighborhoods, storefronts went up in flames, and for every obituary with an outlaw's patch, the whispers almost always included one name: Yves Apache Trudeau. The outlaws had numbers. They had their allies in Ontario through Satan's choice. They had a reputation south of the border. What they didn't have was an answer to a man like Trudeau. His style wasn't reckless, it was patient. He stalked his marks, charted their routines, and then chose the moment when they were most vulnerable. For a while, it seemed like every time an outlaw exhaled in public, Trudeau was there to make sure it was their last breath. His first high-profile strike was the assassination of the outlaw's Montreal president. Trudeau planted a bomb beneath the man's car, wired with the kind of precision only a demolitions expert could manage. The explosion rocked the street, shredded the vehicle, and sent a clear message. The Angels weren't just fighting, they were hunting. Within weeks, Trudeau walked up to another outlaw lieutenant's door, knocked, and when the man answered, shot him point blank in the head. The outlaws tried to retaliate, but the imbalance was glaring. Their attempts at drive-bys fizzled, their bombs misfired. One Angel took a grazing bullet wound to the arm. That was the sum of their success. Meanwhile, Trudeau's body count mounted. His methods were unpredictable, sometimes a carefully wired detonation, sometimes a sudden knife in an alley. To police, it was maddening. To the Angels, it was invaluable. Fear spread through the outlaws' ranks like rot. Men skipped meetings, stayed off the streets, or tried to mask their routines. Still, bodies kept turning up. That fear reached its breaking point when Roxy Jute MPL, a senior outlaw, decided they needed a knockout blow. If they couldn't kill Trudeau, they needed to cripple the Angels' leadership. On October 12, 1978, the outlaws struck during a meeting between Yves Buteau, the Angels' national president, and Ontario bikers they hoped to recruit. Gunmen stormed a Montreal bar with pistols and a sawed-off shotgun. When the smoke cleared, 2 Angels and 2 allies were dead, with others bleeding out on the floor. Buteau survived, but the message was clear. The outlaws weren't finished yet. For Trudeau, it was personal. He was ordered to eliminate Roxy du Temple at any cost. Weeks later, Trudeau saw a man on the street who resembled him. He walked up, asked in French, "Are you Roxy?" The man didn't answer. Trudeau drew his gun and executed him on the spot. Only later did the newspapers reveal the truth. Trudeau had killed not du Temple, but a German tourist named William Wickold. The man hadn't responded because he didn't understand French. To Trudeau, it was hilarious. He laughed about it for weeks, brushing off the horror. His only complaint? The Angels refused to pay him for the hit, because it wasn't the right man. But a few months later, he made up for the mistake. The real Roxy du Temple was blown apart by a Trudeau car bomb. With that, the war tilted fully in the Angels' favor. Every rival began glancing over their shoulders, wondering if that quiet figure in the corner might be the one they never saw coming. A reputation written in blood. By the early 1980s, Yves Apache Trudeau wasn't just another Hell's Angel, he was their sharpest weapon. In under 5 years, he had killed more men than most outlaw bikers saw in a lifetime. Each strike reinforced his legend. Rivals called him a ghost, someone who could vanish into the crowd after a murder as though he'd never been there at all. To the Angels, he was something even rarer: reliable. Reliability is currency in organized crime. A man who can smuggle a load, keep a secret, or pull a trigger without flinching is worth more than a dozen loudmouths. Trudeau's reliability was terrifying. When told to kill, he didn't hesitate, argue, or look for excuses. He studied the target, planned the logistics, and executed with cold efficiency. If it meant waiting for days, staking out a parking lot, or wiring explosives in silence, he did it without complaint. The outlaws learned this the hardest way. After Du Temple's death, the paranoia in their ranks became chronic. Leaders stopped driving their own cars. Some avoided their usual bars and restaurants, others stayed locked indoors. Still, Trudeau found ways to reach them. One high-ranking outlaw was gunned down the moment he opened his own front door. Another was blown to pieces by a bomb wired to his ignition. The cumulative effect was devastating. Morale collapsed. Inside the Angels, Trudeau's star rose quickly. President Yves Buteau, impressed by his precision, tasked him with expanding operations. Trudeau was sent north of Montreal to establish the Laval chapter, a move designed to project Angel power further into Quebec. But Laval quickly earned a reputation: wild, reckless, out of control. Its members flaunted club rules, used the drugs they were meant to sell, and attracted unwanted police attention. Even Trudeau, who had once been seen as methodical, slipped deeper into cocaine addiction. The contradiction was striking. On one hand, Trudeau's hits remained meticulously planned. On the other, his personal life was collapsing into chaos. He burned through staggering amounts of cocaine, rumored to be over $60,000 worth in a matter of months. When not planning murders, he was in bars, twitching with paranoia, or holed up with a gun in hand. He had become indispensable to the Angels, but also dangerously unstable. Still, his services were called upon for delicate work. In 1982, the Angels' most critical allies, the West End Gang, who controlled Montreal's port, faced betrayal. Their leader, Frank Ryan, discovered that 2 Angels had plotted to kidnap his children over a cocaine debt. Furious, Ryan demanded immediate action, or he'd sever ties, cutting off the Angels' drug supply. To kill one's own members was nearly unthinkable, but Ryan's demand was absolute. The assignment went to Trudeau. He lured the 2 men out for drinks, got them drunk, then drove them to a quiet stretch near the St. Lawrence River. There, he executed them with shots to the head and dumped their bodies. It was a murder that barely rippled outward, but inside the underworld it showed exactly why Trudeau was feared. He killed not only enemies, but his own if the Angels demanded it. By this point, Trudeau's kill count hovered in the dozens. Newspapers would later tally 18 outlaws dead at his hand, not to mention his victims among independents, allies, and innocents. His nickname, Apache, was spoken in hushed tones. Not with admiration, no one admired him, but with a kind of reluctant awe. Yet the same reputation that made him untouchable also painted a target on his back. The Angels could only tolerate so much chaos from Laval, and whispers began that even their prized Hitman might one day be deemed expendable. The Angels' crown jewel and their liability. By 1983, Yves Apache Trudeau had carved out a place inside the Hells Angels that few men could rival. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a one-man strike team, trusted with assignments too sensitive for anyone else. Presidents called his number when diplomacy failed, when money was on the line, or when reputations had to be salvaged with blood. But the very qualities that made Trudeau invaluable also made him a growing liability. His cocaine addiction was no longer a side habit, it was consuming him. Witnesses described him pacing rooms with a pistol in one hand and a straw in the other. He was gaunt, twitchy, but still able to focus with surgical precision when the Angels demanded it. That contradiction, addicted yet lethal, made him both terrifying and unpredictable. The Laval chapter magnified the problem. From the beginning, Laval was infamous. Its members flaunted their patches in public, baited police, ignored orders, and squandered profits on drugs they should have been selling. Arrests piled up for petty offenses, embarrassing the Angels' broader organization. Rival gangs mocked Laval as sloppy junkies, and even allies like the Montreal Mafia began pressuring the Angels to rein them in. For Trudeau, Laval was both home and cage. It gave him the autonomy to run jobs, collect cash, and indulge his vices without oversight. But it also chained him to men whose recklessness was drawing heat from every direction. By the mid-1980s, Laval wasn't just a problem, it was a threat to the Angels' survival in Quebec. Even so, Trudeau's reputation still insulated him. When the Angels needed precision work, he was the man they trusted. His demolition skills were unmatched. His willingness to kill without hesitation made him a reliable enforcer when negotiations stalled. And his paranoia, often seen as a flaw, kept him alive through jobs that would have doomed less cautious men. But cracks in his standing were visible. At one meeting, Trudeau reportedly clashed with other members over his constant drug use. He brushed off the criticism, laughing that the coke makes me sharper. In reality, it was making him erratic. Friends noticed him hallucinating threats, jumping at shadows, and pulling guns on allies during drug-fueled rages. The leadership could tolerate violence. They could even tolerate addiction. Up to a point. What they couldn't tolerate was exposure. Laval's antics, combined with Trudeau's notoriety, were putting the Angels under a magnifying glass. Every time a bomb exploded or a body washed up, journalists whispered Apache. And every time his name made the papers, the Angels' larger network bristled. It didn't help that Trudeau enjoyed the spotlight. Unlike many hitmen who preferred anonymity, he relished his infamy. He would smile for cameras outside funerals, wave at reporters, and play the part of the feared assassin. To the Angels, that kind of visibility was dangerous. To Trudeau, it was proof of his untouchability. Behind closed doors, the whispers started. Was it time to cut him loose? Could Laval be brought to heel without eliminating its most notorious member? And if Trudeau himself ever sensed the shift, how long before paranoia turned into preemptive betrayal? For now, though, he was still the Angels' crown jewel, a jewel they knew might one day explode in their hands. The turning point, when loyalty becomes a liability. By 1984, the Hells Angels had emerged from Quebec's first biker war bloodied, but victorious. The outlaws had been pushed back to Ontario. Montreal's underworld whispered about how ruthless the Angels had proven themselves to be. And yet, inside their own ranks, cracks were widening, cracks big enough to swallow even their most notorious hitman. The Laval chapter was the source of it all. Its members had become the embodiment of every stereotype outsiders used to mock bikers. Drug-soaked, undisciplined, reckless, and impossible to control. They weren't just using cocaine, they were inhaling the profits. They weren't just running guns, they were flashing them in bars for anyone to see. The Laval clubhouse was a neon sign for police attention. For Yves Apache Trudeau, Laval was both shield and danger. It protected him because, despite his notoriety, he blended into a crew already infamous for chaos. But it also endangered him because Laval was now seen as an infection. And the cure, increasingly whispered in meetings between senior Angels, was amputation. The decisive moment came after the death of Yves Buteau, the Angels' national president in Canada. Gunned down outside a Montreal restaurant in 1983, Buteau had been one of Trudeau's greatest champions. Under his leadership, Laval's excesses were tolerated, if only because their violence kept rivals in check. Without him, the political winds shifted. Michel Langlois, who took the reins after Buteau, had little patience for Laval's antics. Pressure was mounting, not just from inside the Angels, but also from powerful allies, the Montreal Mafia and the West End Gang. Both groups warned that Laval's recklessness was drawing too much heat, jeopardizing the steady flow of drugs and money. For Trudeau, the danger wasn't abstract. He had heard the whispers, meetings he wasn't invited to, glances exchanged when he walked into a room, rumors that Laval might be dealt with in one decisive strike. His paranoia, sharpened by cocaine and years of surviving ambushes, told him the threat was real. Then came the clearest signal. In March 1985, senior Angels secretly gathered in Sherbrooke. The verdict was unanimous. Laval was to be declared in bad standing. A death sentence in biker terms. Every man in the chapter would be forced into retirement, absorbed elsewhere, or eliminated. For most, that meant death. For Trudeau, it meant something worse, betrayal by the very organization he had killed for. The plan was simple: invite Laval to what was pitched as a party at the Sherbrooke clubhouse. Once inside, ambush them. One by one, gun them down. It was to be a massacre hidden under the guise of brotherhood. What the plotters didn't count on was Trudeau's sixth sense, the paranoia that had kept him alive through countless hits. In the days leading up to the party, he felt the walls closing in. The timing felt wrong, the insistence that everyone attend felt forced. And so, while his brothers prepared for the trip, Trudeau made a choice that would save his life. He checked himself into a drug detox facility in OK. That single act of self-preservation spared him from what would become one of the darkest chapters in Hell's Angels history, the Lennoxville Massacre. The Lennoxville Massacre, brothers betray brothers. On March 24, 1985, the Sherbrooke clubhouse hummed with anticipation. Officially, it was a party, an inter-chapter gathering of the Hells Angels, meant to unify the brotherhood after years of war. Unofficially, it was an execution. The Laval chapter, with its reckless drug binges and endless police attention, had been marked for elimination. And the men tasked with carrying it out weren't outsiders or rivals, they were fellow angels. The trap was cruel in its simplicity. Members of Laval arrived expecting music, drinks, and camaraderie. Instead, they were greeted by a sea of grim faces. Within minutes, armed angels from Sherbrooke, Halifax, and Montreal herded Laval into a small, windowless room. 40 men against a handful, the order was clear, guns raised, the room erupted. What followed would be remembered as the Lennoxville Massacre. Laval's members were cut down in a hail of bullets, some shot where they stood, others executed after surrendering. No hesitation, no mercy. By the time the echoes faded, 5 men lay dead. The rest of Laval's chapter had either been forcibly retired, absorbed elsewhere, or were marked for later elimination. It was a bloodbath that rippled far beyond biker culture. The Montreal Mafia, who had long tolerated the Angels, looked on in disgust. Even criminals accustomed to betrayal recoiled. The massacre wasn't seen as strategy. It was seen as fratricide, a violation of the outlaw code. If brothers could be slaughtered so casually, what did loyalty mean? But one man wasn't there. Yves Apache Trudeau. His paranoia, sharpened by cocaine and instinct, had pushed him into rehab just days before. Whether it was divine timing or survival instinct, he had dodged his own execution. Word of the massacre reached him quickly. The brothers he had bled with were gone, executed not by enemies but by the men who wore the same patch. Trudeau's reaction was complicated. On one hand, he had survived what should have been certain death. On the other, survival came with a price. He was now a marked man. Survivors of Laval were told they could return to the fold, but only by proving their loyalty with fresh blood. For Trudeau, the demand was chillingly personal. He was ordered to kill Jean-Marc Doneguet, Laval's accountant, one of the few who had escaped the massacre. Only then could he reclaim his colors. Trudeau complied. He tracked Doneguet, strangled him, and left his body in the trunk of an abandoned car. On paper, it restored him. In reality, it only deepened his unease. Because even as he carried out the order, Trudeau knew the whispers were still there. The massacre hadn't just erased Laval, it had erased the illusion of brotherhood. If Laval could be sacrificed, then so could Apache. The Lennoxville Massacre sent shockwaves through Quebec. It cemented the Angels' reputation as ruthless even to their own. It also sparked something unintended: resistance. One man disgusted by the betrayal, Salvatore Cazzetta, would refuse to join the Angels. Instead, he would form the Rock Machine, a gang that years later would drag Quebec into the bloodiest biker war in history. For Trudeau, Lennoxville was a turning point. He had cheated death once, but paranoia whispered louder than ever. The next bullet might not come from a rival. It might come from the brothers he once trusted. Marked for death, Apache's narrow escape and rising paranoia. For Yves Apache Trudeau, the Lennoxville Massacre had been a narrow escape. His stint in rehab spared him from execution, but survival didn't mean safety. In fact, it may have sealed his fate. He was no longer just a hitman with a reputation. He was a liability who knew too much. And in the world of outlaw bikers, liabilities don't last long. Killing Jean-Marc Doneguet, Laval's accountant, had been his ticket back into the fold. The Angels told him it proved his loyalty, that he had earned another chance. But deep down, Trudeau knew better. His paranoia wasn't just drug-fueled, it was experience sharpened into instinct. The massacre had proven that loyalty meant nothing. If Laval could be wiped out overnight, then so could Apache. The whispers became harder to ignore. He heard rumors of a bounty, $50,000, offered quietly within the Angels themselves, for his death. The figure wasn't outlandish. Trudeau had killed more than 40 people by this point, including rivals, allies, and even his own brothers when ordered. His kill count made him invaluable, but it also made him dangerous. He knew the details of dozens of operations. He had carried out orders too sensitive to be spoken aloud in meetings. If he ever flipped, the fallout could cripple the Angels. Trudeau's paranoia turned into ritual. He never sat with his back to a door. He scanned every bar for exits before ordering a drink. He carried weapons constantly, sometimes multiple guns, a knife, even grenades. Friends recalled him twitching through conversations, eyes darting, hands never steady. Coke only amplified the fear. Nights blurred into binges where he'd pace rooms, muttering that someone was coming for him. And maybe someone was. Prison only heightened the danger. In 1985, shortly after Donegay's murder, Trudeau was arrested on weapons charges and sentenced to a year behind bars. Inside, he felt the noose tightening. Word spread quickly that the Angels wanted him gone, and prison was the perfect place to stage it. Here, he couldn't run. Here, knives could find him in the dark. It was in those grim walls that Trudeau made his most fateful decision. If the Angels wanted him dead, he'd beat them to the punch. For the first time in his life, the infamous Hitman turned to the police. What he offered was shocking. Testimony. He would talk. About everything. The authorities barely believed him at first. Informants were rare in biker culture. Full patch members flipping was almost unheard of. But Trudeau wasn't just another member. He was their assassin. And when he started talking, the details flowed like a ledger of blood. He named names. He mapped hits. He recounted operations with the precision of a man who had carried them out himself. In exchange, he demanded protection. A cushy cell, money, a chance at a reduced sentence. The government agreed, uneasy but desperate. They had never had an informant of this caliber before. For the Angels, it was the ultimate betrayal. Their most feared hitman, the man who had scalped rivals and blown enemies to pieces, was now sitting across from detectives, telling their secrets. Apache had saved his own life again, but this time he'd lit a fuse that would burn the Hells Angels from the inside out. The deal with the devil, testifying against the Angels. When Yves Apache Trudeau first sat across from investigators, the air was thick with disbelief. Here was the Hells Angels' ace assassin, the man whispered about in bars and courtrooms alike, volunteering to talk. Most police officers had spent years dreaming of a break like this. Now they weren't sure if it was real, or if it was some elaborate trap. But it was real. Trudeau wasn't bluffing, he was bargaining. The deal was simple. In exchange for his cooperation, he wanted a lighter sentence, money and protection from the brothers who now wanted him buried. The government agreed, hesitant but intrigued. What Trudeau offered was too valuable to ignore. Once the pen hit paper, the confessions poured out. Trudeau admitted to 43 murders, not just rivals, though 33 were confirmed outlaws or their allies, but also 10 innocent civilians caught in the blast radius of his bombs or mistaken identity. He also confessed to 29 shootings, 10 bombings, 3 beatings, 1 strangulation, and 15 attempted murders. The numbers were staggering. In one lifetime, one man had killed more people than the entire Canadian military had during the Gulf War. But the body count was only part of it. What stunned investigators was the detail. Trudeau remembered times, places, getaway routes, and even the small talk before some of the hits. He gave police maps of safe houses, names of couriers, locations of stash spots. His paranoia, which had once made him so lethal, now made him an encyclopedic witness. His testimony directly implicated 39 Hells Angels, including senior leadership. Canada's national president, Michel Langlois, fled to Morocco rather than face the charges. Others were dragged into courtrooms they never expected to see. For the first time, the Angels' aura of invincibility cracked. Yet the deal Trudeau struck was as controversial as his crimes. He pled guilty to 43 counts of manslaughter, not murder, and was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in just 7 years. On top of that, he was promised comfortable treatment, a private cell, weekly cigarette money, and $40,000 over 4 years. To the public, it was a disgrace. Families of victims watched in horror as the man who had killed their loved ones walked into court smirking, knowing he would likely see freedom again. Journalists called it a deal with the devil. Citizens flooded radio lines, demanding harsher punishment. But the government defended its choice. Without Trudeau, they argued, the Angels would never have been dismantled to the extent they were. His testimony resolved nearly 90 unsolved murders. He had given them what no other informant ever could, the anatomy of the Angels' inner circle. Inside the gang world, however, his betrayal was unforgivable. To patch over to the Angels was to pledge loyalty unto death. Trudeau had broken that oath, not quietly but spectacularly. His name became poison in biker circles. Even criminals outside the Angels despised him. In their world, killing was business, but betrayal was the one sin you couldn't wash away. And yet, as much as they hated him, they couldn't touch him. For the first time in his bloody career, Yves Apache Trudeau was untouchable. Not because of the Angels, but because of the state. But freedom was coming. And when it did, the man who once laughed about killing the wrong man would walk out of prison with a new name, a new life, and a chance to start over. At least, that's what he thought. Freedom in disguise, Apache's new life after prison. In 1994, Yves Apache Trudeau walked out of prison a free man, or at least a man disguised as one. He had served only 9 years of his life sentence. The deal he struck with the government had held. For 43 murders and dozens of other crimes, his price was a fraction of the time his victims had lost. But he did not walk out as Yves Trudeau. He walked out with a new name, a new identity, and the government's hope that anonymity would protect him from both vengeance and his own past. Relocated to Valleyfield, a quiet town in southwest Quebec, he was placed in an environment so ordinary it felt surreal. Gone were the roaring Harleys, the blood-soaked alleys, the bombed-out apartments. His new reality was modest, working as an orderly in a nursing home and driving a bus for handicapped residents. For a time, it almost worked. To neighbors, he was just another middle-aged man, soft-spoken and unassuming. He formed a relationship with a woman who knew nothing of his history. He lived in a modest apartment, clocked into his job, and faded into the background. For the first time since his teens, Yves Apache Trudeau wasn't a feared assassin. He was a man nobody noticed. But hiding from the world didn't erase who he had been. Paranoia trailed him like a shadow. He scanned mirrors as he drove, worried an old angel might appear at a stoplight. He rarely entered a room without checking for exits. And beneath the quiet routine, the cravings gnawed. Cocaine had been both his fuel and his weakness. By the late 1990s, temptation returned. When he lost his job in 2000, the fragile normalcy unraveled. With no work to occupy his days, Trudeau slipped back into old patterns. Long nights, powder on mirrors, paranoia mounting. To the woman who loved him, he was erratic and restless. To himself, he was slipping back into the abyss he thought he'd left behind. The final spiral came in 2004, when Trudeau's name reappeared in headlines. Arrested for the rape of a 14-year-old boy, the man who had once testified in courtrooms, who had lived quietly under protection, was now branded with another layer of infamy: child predator. The fallout was swift. Because he was still on probation from his earlier manslaughter convictions, the new crime triggered an automatic resentencing to life in prison. This time, there would be no cushy deal, no leniency. His betrayal of the angels had made him a pariah. His new crime made him untouchable in another way, loathed by both the public and the criminals he once called brothers. When the judge handed down the sentence, he didn't mince words. "In your lifetime, you have killed more people than the entire Canadian military did in the Gulf War." Trudeau, frail and hollow from years of cocaine and decline, barely reacted. The man once feared as the Angels' most ruthless hitman had stumbled back into the only place that ever truly fit him: a cage, but this time it was permanent. A monster in solitude, life behind bars. When Yves Apache Trudeau was sent back to prison in 2004, it was not the return of a feared outlaw, it was the burial of a man already damned. This time, there would be no sweetheart deals, no cushy single cells with perks. The public outrage over his earlier leniency was still raw, and his new crime, a sexual assault on a 14-year-old boy, stripped away whatever protection his status as an informant had once offered. Prison officials knew immediately Trudeau couldn't survive in the general population. Not because the Angels still wanted him dead, though they did, but because his label as both a traitor and a pedophile marked him as the lowest of the low. For bikers, betrayal was unforgivable. For inmates, crimes against children carried their own brand of justice. If he were released into the yard, he wouldn't last a day. So he was locked away in near-total isolation, 23 hours a day in a concrete cell. 1 hour of exercise, alone, behind walls too high to see over. His meals slid under the door. His only human contact came through reinforced glass or in heavily guarded transfers. For a man who once walked into bars laughing at death, who had built his reputation on presence and intimidation, the silence was crushing. The guards who dealt with him described a shell of the killer he once was. The swagger was gone. The cocaine that had once kept him wired was replaced by frailty and paranoia. He spoke in a raspy voice, his once menacing figure reduced to a frail, hollowed-out frame. At times, he seemed like a man already rehearsing his own death. But Trudeau's isolation didn't mean he was forgotten. Every inmate knew his name. Some had grown up hearing stories about Apache, the hitman who blew men to pieces and strangled others in back alleys. Yet to them, he wasn't a legend. He was a target. Even whispers of his presence were enough to stir hatred. Guards intercepted multiple plots to take him out, including crude plans involving smuggled shivs and poisoned food. Even in solitary, Trudeau wasn't immune to violence. On at least one occasion, another prisoner tried to get to him during transfer. The attempt was foiled, but it underscored the reality. He would live the rest of his life hunted, not by rivals on the street, but by the ghosts of his reputation inside prison walls. Ironically, the man once feared for his paranoia was now living in the very nightmare he had always anticipated. He checked over his shoulder, flinched at footsteps, and stared at shadows in his cell. Only now the threats weren't imagined, they were real and constant. The angels had long since washed their hands of him. Officially, Trudeau was expelled from the club, condemned as both a traitor and a liability. To the underworld, his fate was fitting. A man who had killed dozens without remorse, now rotting in a box, powerless, unloved, and forgotten except by those who despised him. And yet, as the years ticked by, fate had one final twist for the man who had outlived massacres, wars, and betrayal. His body itself would betray him. The skeleton of a killer, illness and decline. By the mid-2000s, Yves Apache Trudeau was no longer the coked-up executioner who once ruled Montreal's underworld with fear. Years of hard living, stress, and confinement finally took their toll. In 2006, doctors delivered the news. He was dying. Bone marrow cancer, an incurable disease that would eat him from the inside out. For many, this diagnosis felt like poetic justice. After decades of killing men in cold blood and laughing about it, after betraying his brothers and re-victimizing society by preying on a child, Trudeau's body itself turned against him. It wasn't a quick death in a hail of bullets, nor the sudden shock of a prison shanking. It was slow, painful, and humiliating, exactly the opposite of the ruthless image he once cultivated. Within months, the change was visible. The burly biker who once scalped enemies and blew up apartments with homemade bombs was reduced to a frail husk. Guards described him as a skeleton of a man. He needed a wheelchair to move down the corridor. His voice, once booming and threatening, became a thin rasp. The man who had strutted into bars, guns blazing, was now a shadow shivering in hospital gowns. Even as he wasted away, Trudeau was not allowed into the prison's general population. He remained in protective custody, watched closely, guarded heavily, isolated until the end. Other inmates mocked him, calling him the sick dog, and spreading rumors that he was faking illness for sympathy. But it was no act. The cancer stripped him of everything: strength, dignity, and the ability to project fear. For victims' families, the sight of his decline stirred conflicting emotions. Some hoped he would suffer every moment until his last breath, believing that the disease was a form of divine punishment for the dozens he had slaughtered. Others were bitter, pointing out that Trudeau had escaped the violent end he deserved and instead was being cared for by taxpayer-funded doctors, receiving medication and treatment denied to many of his victims. Trudeau himself seemed to accept his fate with the same cold detachment that had defined his life. He rarely spoke about remorse, and when he did, it came across as hollow. Those who visited him described a man who spoke little of the past but carried an air of resignation, as if he knew the years of paranoia and blood had finally caught up with him. By 2008, his health was in free fall. Cancer had devoured his body. He spent his days in pain, often confined to bed, unable to stand without assistance. His final months were marked by the bitter irony of his situation. The man who once struck terror into the streets of Montreal was now pitied, reduced to a patient awaiting death. On July 29, 2008, Yves Apache Trudeau finally died at the age of 62. There was no great gangland funeral, no procession of Harleys rumbling through the city. His death was barely a whisper compared to the chaos of his life. For some, it was closure. For others, it was a reminder that monsters sometimes fade quietly, rather than being destroyed in the blaze they create. Yet even in death, Trudeau's legacy lived on, a bloody trail of murders, betrayals, and a final lesson. Even the most feared killers cannot escape their reckoning. Legacy of blood, how Apache changed the angels forever. The death of Yves Apache Trudeau did not erase his influence. If anything, it forced the Hells Angels, and the world watching, to confront the stain he left on their history. Trudeau wasn't just another outlaw biker, he was a prototype, a one-man army whose efficiency as a killer proved both the strength and the weakness of the Angels' empire. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Trudeau showed what one ruthless man could do with the backing of a powerful club. 23 outlaws killed, dozens more assassinations and bombings. For years, he made the Angels untouchable in Quebec, clearing rivals off the streets like pieces on a chessboard. The club rose in power, but at what cost? Trudeau's tactics were so extreme that they drew attention from every level of law enforcement, eventually forcing the Angels into the spotlight they had once been able to avoid. The Lennoxville massacre of 1985 revealed just how dangerous it was to let a man like Trudeau thrive unchecked. His own addiction, erratic violence, and disregard for rules had turned him into a liability. That massacre was not just about wiping out an unruly chapter. It was also about eliminating men like Trudeau before their chaos destroyed the entire club. Ironically, Trudeau's paranoia saved his life, but it left him isolated and vulnerable. His expulsion and betrayal of the Angels became the single greatest intelligence victory law enforcement had ever achieved against them. Trudeau's testimony led to the imprisonment of nearly 40 members, including senior leadership. It left a vacuum in Quebec that allowed a new generation, men like Maurice Mom Boucher, to rise to power. In many ways, Trudeau's blood-soaked career paved the way for the Quebec Biker War of the 1990s. Without his killings, without the Lennoxville fallout, without the fractures he exposed in the Angels organization, history might have unfolded very differently. But Trudeau's legacy was not confined to the Angels. His story also reshaped Canadian policing. The shocking leniency of his plea deal, life in prison with parole after 7 years, weekly cash for cigarettes, and eventual release under a new identity, sparked outrage that reverberated for decades. Families of victims protested that the justice system had bargained with the devil, trading the dignity of the dead for a handful of convictions. Politicians came under fire for allowing such an agreement, and prosecutors were forced to defend themselves, arguing that no one else could have brought down so many senior Angels at once. In the underworld, Trudeau's name became both infamous and cursed. For younger bikers, he was a cautionary tale, the assassin who killed too much, too recklessly, and ended up despised by both his brothers and the world. For rival gangs, he was a reminder of how brutal the Angels could be when they unleashed their most ruthless enforcers. His life forced the Angels to rethink how they used violence. No longer could they rely on a single man to carry out their dirtiest work without risking exposure. After Trudeau, the Angels adopted more careful, structured methods, outsourcing hits, fragmenting responsibility, and burying their violence deeper under layers of secrecy. Yet, despite everything, the legend of Apache Trudeau endures. Some remember him as the most feared hitman Canada ever produced. Others remember him as a monster who laughed while murdering innocents. Either way, his legacy is written in blood, etched into the DNA of the Hells Angels forever. The infamous deal, outrage and betrayal of justice. When word broke of the deal between Yves Apache Trudeau and the Canadian government, the reaction was immediate and furious. Here was a man who admitted to killing 43 people, planting bombs, strangling rivals, and even laughing about murdering an innocent tourist. And yet, he was granted a plea bargain that looked, to the public, more like a reward than a punishment. Life in prison with eligibility for parole after just 7 years. A cushy single cell with privileges other inmates could only dream of. $40,000 in payments over 4 years, plus a weekly allowance for cigarettes. For the families of his victims, it was like spitting on graves. Journalists slammed the deal as a travesty of justice. Editorial pages across Canada accused prosecutors of selling their souls to secure convictions. Radio shows buzzed with callers demanding to know how a confessed mass murderer could end up living in relative comfort while his victims lay in unmarked graves. One paper wrote bitterly, "Trudeau killed more Canadians than died in the Gulf War, and yet he walks out with pocket money." The justice system defended itself by pointing to results. Trudeau's testimony had put away 39 Hells Angels, dismantled part of their Quebec structure, and exposed a web of criminal activity that would have been impossible to penetrate without him. He was a devil, yes, but a useful one. Prosecutors insisted they had no choice. Without his cooperation, the Angels would remain untouchable. But for the public, this logic fell flat. It wasn't just about outcomes. It was about the message that if you kill enough people, your crimes become leverage. The outrage grew when news emerged that Trudeau had, in fact, been the perpetrator of many of the very murders he was helping solve. Out of the 90 cold cases he closed for investigators, nearly half were his own handiwork. For victims' families, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. Parents of young men gunned down in the biker wars asked why their son's killer was allowed a second chance at life. Widows of innocent bystanders pointed out that their loved ones never got parole. The justice system, in their eyes, had become complicit in dishonoring the dead. Even inside law enforcement, the deal was divisive. Some officers admitted they hated working with Trudeau, calling him arrogant and remorseless, smirking during debriefings as he described his kills in chilling detail. Others said he seemed proud of outsmarting everyone, from rival bikers to the government now paying for his cigarettes. A detective later remarked, "He knew he'd beaten the system." That's what haunted us. The fallout of the deal changed Canadian justice. It sparked debates in Parliament about the limits of plea bargains, especially in cases involving mass murderers and organized crime. Public trust in the system wavered, with polls showing widespread belief that Trudeau had gotten away with murder, literally. And yet, despite the outrage, the deal stood. Trudeau walked free after just 9 years, his crimes reduced in the official record to manslaughter. The man once feared as Canada's deadliest hitman now lived under a new name, sheltered by the very system that had sworn to protect society from him. It was, in many ways, the final insult to his victims. For them, justice had not just failed, it had been mocked. The final reckoning, death of the Apache, Yves Apache. Trudeau lived longer than anyone expected. He had survived gang wars, assassination plots, betrayal, and even the wrath of the very club he once served so ruthlessly. But by the late 2000s, time had finally cornered him. The man who once laughed while scalping victims was reduced to a frail, broken figure, his reign of terror ending not in a blaze of gunfire, but in a hospital bed. In 2006, doctors diagnosed Trudeau with bone marrow cancer. To those who had watched him escape death countless times, it felt like karma had finally arrived. Guards who saw him described a ghost of a man, skeletal, hunched, his booming voice now a whisper. He shuffled in a wheelchair, a shadow of the feared hitman who once terrified Quebec. To some, this slow, agonizing decline was the justice courts had failed to deliver. As his health worsened, Trudeau spent his final years in near-total isolation. Solitary confinement had already defined his prison life, but illness deepened the silence. He had few visitors. The angels had cast him out long ago, branding him a traitor. Families of his victims loathed him, many openly saying they hoped his death would be drawn out and painful. Even among inmates, he was despised, not just for being a rat, but for his conviction as a child predator. By 2008, the end was near. He weighed little more than a skeleton, his body eaten away by disease. In his last interviews with prison doctors, he showed no sign of remorse. No apologies for the 43 murders he admitted to, no regret for the innocents caught in his bombs, no sorrow for the teenager he assaulted late in life. If anything, he seemed indifferent, almost resigned, as if he had always known his story could end only in disgrace. On July 29, 2008, Yves Apache Trudeau finally died at age 62. There was no biker funeral, no procession of Harleys rumbling through Montreal in his honor. Instead, he slipped out of the world quietly, buried without the glory he once chased. His passing barely made headlines compared to the terror he once inspired. But for those who remembered his crimes, the death carried weight. One victim's sister summed it up with chilling clarity. Killing to him was like buying a bag of milk. A guy like that doesn't have a soul. That cancer is justice. In the end, Trudeau's legacy was a paradox. He had been the Angels' most effective weapon, yet also their greatest liability. His killing spree helped the gang dominate Quebec, but his betrayal crippled them in ways they never fully recovered from. He lived long enough to see his name turned from a symbol of fear into one of disgrace. The story of Yves Apache Trudeau is not just about one man. It is about the cost of unchecked violence, the compromises of justice, and the thin line between loyalty and betrayal in the outlaw world. His life left behind a trail of blood and a reminder that even the most feared killers cannot escape their reckoning.